Hello everyone. So, it is the end of May. Well, it's the end of June where you are in the future. But back here, in the past, it's the end of May. Which means, it's time for an update. The wind agrees. So May has been an interesting month. It has been very busy. I took on a temp job, so I haven't been home as much. It's a blessing and a curse. Obviously, it sucks not to be home, to be able to work on things. But on the flip side, it has forced me to not move as quickly as I might have otherwise. And I think in this case, that might be beneficial. So, to try and sum it up, here's an update of basically what you've missed in the past month. First of all, most everything that was green at the end of April is more or less probably brown right now on the property, excluding native plants. Our poppies put out their flowers and now they're brown because that's the end of their life cycle. The carrots that we had, we finally pulled out of the ground. They're kind of small, but they were very tasty. The mustard finished its cycle and we harvested all the mustard and are working on winnowing and processing all of the seeds, but now the plants that are left are basically brown. The peas did bloom earlier in the month, so did the vetch. The vetch is actually still blooming now. The peas, however, are on their way out. Most of the pea pods are drying and we will be harvesting those once they are dry. And as you can see across the yard, most of the grass is completely brown and dried out now. The radish has finally finished its life cycle, and so we've harvested all of that. And the amaranth finally succumbed to the sun, and it is gone now too. So the yard looks pretty barren and sad. And that's not for lack of trying on our end. We have cast quite a bit of seed across the backyard, but so far not much has actually taken. There's only one one seedling that has actually survived or even shown up to begin with in the basins, and that is this random thing that we're not quite sure what it is. On the plus side, our bee house has a whole bunch of new residents and also has these random holes that appeared. We're hoping that it's because the pupa inside actually got out, but we're not really sure, honestly. The tansies are still doing quite well, and some of them are still producing flowers, but most of those are also going to seed. Interestingly enough, I found a picture of one of the tansies that we harvested some of these seeds from, and as you can tell, the size is quite different. So we are out here today on the verge of sunset, collecting these seeds because one of our iNaturalist buddies, thank you Steve Jones, told us that it was chia, and chia does grow pretty well out here, and so now we hopefully can have some seeds from something that actually, is local and works. Why don't you just take little sticks? And the superstar of the backyard right now is still the tomato plant. There are more tomatoes on this plant than I can humanly eat in a given month, so I've been handing them out like candy to whoever will take them. Tomatoes. But of course, you're probably not here for that. Most of you are probably here because you're interested in the plant prison. So let's show you what the plant prison looks like. So as you can see, the plant prison is about as sad as the rest of the yard. It contains plants that are mostly gone, and what plants still remain are very stunted and probably are on their way out. We've tried to add amendments, we've tried different watering strategies. The wind is interrupting me. Why do I have so many wind chimes? when I'm trying to film? The answer is because it's work to take them down. So as you can see, most of the plants are stunted, gone, and in a lot of cases on their way out. Which is, of course, sad. No one wants that to be their garden, especially when you have... I love the sound of Palo Verde against tin. So I went somewhere where there was no wind, which is inside, because sometimes nature needs to f*** off. So at the end of the day, even though the plant prison is pretty much a, dare I say, failure at this point, we are hoping to use it more as a learning experience, since it does indicate in the backyard, no matter where in the ground we put our seeds, that the germination rate is actually pretty darn low. I was looking through some of my old notes that I took in a class taught by Brandon, the guy who runs Southwest Victory Gardens down in Tucson. And he mentioned that compacted soil often will not retain water very well. It doesn't release nutrients to plants very well. It has low germination rates. Your plants often end up stunted and not very healthy looking. And honestly, that's pretty much what we're dealing with so far. So instead of getting super frustrated about it, we have decided to try and figure out, well, what can we do about it, because we still want to grow things, and even though it's unrealistic at this stage to expect anything besides native plants to grow directly in our soil due to its compaction, it doesn't change the fact that we still want to have vegetables and we still want to be able to grow our own food before fixing every square inch of soil on property. So what do we do to work around it? So from what I can tell, we currently have a couple of options that we can look into in order to start to remedy the situation that we're in, provided that we want to grow food now instead of waiting a couple of years for the soil to rebound, or at least begin to rebound. I say soil because we don't really live on soil, we live on alluvium. Some parts of this mountain range where they cut into place houses or create flat shelves for people to live higher up on the mountain, you can actually see that as soon as they cut into the mountainside, it's almost all bedrock. The amount of soil that we're working with is kind of, dare I say, non-existent. And the three options that we could come across were to either do container gardening and put the soil up into containers and put plants into those containers. We've been a little leery about container gardening because it tends to be kind of expensive. You have to buy, build, or manufacture the containers somehow. I personally am a little hesitant about containers because I'm used to my grandmother putting perennials in containers, and eventually those perennials get so large that they outgrow the containers and you still have to find a place in the ground to put them anyways. So if we do container gardening, we definitely want it to be able to work around the possibility of perennials being included, not just annuals. And one of the biggest holdbacks that we had for container gardening is a lot of times it doesn't actually interact with the soil around it. And I didn't want our gardening prospects, our permaculture, to basically only be contained to one container. I wanted our work to actually influence more of the ecosystem around us, because I want the beneficial aspects of permaculture to actually infiltrate and spread beyond just my front yard. But container gardening, man, the stuff you can do with it. We could look into growing things that break up compacted ground, things like daikon, radish, winter rye, or really anything with super long roots. Of course, that does take time, and we have been growing or attempting to grow these things, but last year we ended up with one daikon, and we've probably got a handful, like maybe 7 winter rye grass plants that came up despite seeding the whole area. So that's an option, but it's a pretty slow option. The other option, besides containing things in containers or trying to break up the ground with plants, is to pile things on top of the ground. These kinds of methods would be things like Hugelkultur, or the Ruth Stout method, or Back to Eden. Hugelkultur involves placing wood at the center of your planting structure. Often Hugelkultur tends to be very vertically driven, so you can browse your plants while standing. And usually there's wood in the center with some organic material, and then there's mulch and soil placed on top of that. Back to Eden tends to place a bunch of mulch directly on the ground, which we've done around the property. It's helpful. I'm not going to deny it. Mulch is by far, hands down, the cheapest, most effective amendment you can add out here in the desert. It's a vital part to our gardening system. But it doesn't appear to be doing enough to help us grow vegetables or annuals any sooner. And then the last method is the Ruth Stout method, which involves basically, it's very similar to Back to Eden, where you basically just put a bunch of hay or straw on top of whatever you're planting and on top of the ground. And in Ruth Stout's part of the country, she doesn't have to water, or she didn't have to water her plants. Hardly ever, if at all. And so while none of these systems was a complete package for us, it certainly got us thinking, how could we use any of these methods to our advantage? And this actually really crystallized for us once Britt discovered Rockeries. It was an offhand mention, a word in an article that we found when they were looking for ways to break up compacted ground. They just happened to mention you could do this with Rockeries, and that was it. But that caused us to go research to figure out what exactly a rockery was, and basically it's a container made of rocks. It looks a lot like this, or at least most of the examples that I found look like this. And we really like that idea because we have lots of material around the property, and we can get a hold of a fair amount of free, large pieces of concrete, rocks, rubble, things that we could make containers with. It addresses the issue that we want our container gardening, when it's done, to actually be able to interact with the rest of the ground around it, because these rockeries that we're building have no bottoms to them at all. Ideally, the roots will be able to grow in the soft soil that is filling the rockery itself, and then if it wants to go down beneath that level into the actual ground itself, the option is there. This also allows us to combine other methods such as the Hugelkultur, the Ruth Stout, and the Back to Eden, because we could put tree branches at the center of these rockeries before putting soil on top. We can also use things like oyas and paper pads in these to help soak up water and dispense water slowly, because the ground's not so compacted that I can't put it in the ground. So, all of that being said, welcome to Plant Prison Part 2. Except this one does not really look like a prison, it's just a planter in the front yard. We built this up using materials that we found on property and got off of the free list on Craigslist. We built up the bottom ring first and sort of outlined it before filling it up with dirt. This is mostly native dirt in the bottom ring. We then found a planter laying around the property that had no bottom with it. We set that on top. That's mostly filled with a liner of paper at the bottom to help water the ground from the inside. We then used a mixture of a whole bunch of potting soil that we poured out of a bunch of grandma's old containers, put that in, and then covered everything with straw. There is a layer of seeds on top of the dirt itself, and then those are covered with straw, trying out the Ruth Stout method to see if that helps to retain the water. And of course, in this case, we were able to use oyas, as I mentioned, because the dirt was loose enough to put them in. The only thing this doesn't really solve is how to get the soil. Luckily, there's supposed to be ways to get free fill dirt out here because of pool companies that are basically digging huge holes in the ground to make people's pools. And so hopefully we can get a hold of somebody that will help bring more soil out here to fill the rest of the planters. We think the rockery method looks promising, if nothing else. And so that is what we are attempting. So the original vegetable garden is looking pretty sad. We'll try and take care of it as long as we can, but I don't have a lot of high hopes for most of the plants inside of it, unfortunately. but it is a learning experience. As I mentioned earlier in the video, not being home has forced me to slow down a little bit, and I think that's important because I was all big into digging the basins and making the berms and doing so much extra digging and manual labor that really wasn't working with our soil type. Not to mention that it would suck to do all that work only to find out that your plants aren't going to grow because the ground is too compacted anyways. So not being home did stop me from just doing activity to do activity, and forced us to take a step back and look around and say, what else could we do about this situation? And I think that was helpful and the better course of action in this case. So that's it for this time. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and enjoyed this update. If you want to follow along with how we continue to move forward with the second vegetable garden, or watch our process for building more rockeries in the rest of these yards, feel free to click that subscribe button. And if you want to be notified when we upload and update, make sure you click the bell next to the subscribe button, and we will see you next time. Bye! So I just finished cutting the video, and it's been a week since we put these seeds in, and look. Of course, seedlings don't necessarily mean we're going to get plants, but it's a start, right?